President Bola Ahmed Tinubu is calling for debt forgiveness for developing countries and measures to recover proceeds of corruption and illicit financial flows from such countries. Speaking at the ongoing 79th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Tinubu, represented by Vice President Shettima, emphasized the importance of inclusivity, equality, and cooperation in addressing global challenges such as terrorism, climate change, poverty, and food crisis. The president also urged world leaders to strengthen multilateralism through deeper cooperation among United Nations member states. President Tinubu, represented by Vice President Kashim Shettima, decried the rise of singularity and nationalism, which he believes undermine collective efforts to resolve global issues. He reaffirmed Nigeria's commitment to multilateralism and expressed concern about the UN's ability to sustain its relevance and resilience.
The rules-based, non-discriminatory, open, fair, inclusive, equitable, and transparent multilateral trading system. We are aware of the debilitating impacts of corruption on global prosperity and national progress. Process of corruption and illicit financial flows constitute a huge chunk of resources needed for sustainable development. The recovery and return of such funds to states of origin is a fundamental principle of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Therefore, the international community must promote practical measures to strengthen international cooperation to recover and return stolen assets and to eradicate safe havens that facilitate illicit flows of funds from developing countries to the developed economies. There is also the urgent need to promote fair and inclusive tax regimes in the world. Nigeria helped introduce the resolution on promotion of inclusive and effective international tax cooperation at the UN. We acknowledge the progress made in the adoption of the terms of reference of the UN Framework Convention on Tax Cooperation. We should deepen this initiative and work towards a UN Framework Convention on Tax Cooperation. Similarly, we must ensure that any reform of the international financial system includes comprehensive debt relief measures to enable sustainable financing for development. Countries of the Global South cannot make meaningful economic progress without special concessions and a review of their current debt burden. The present administration pays due regard to the imperatives of creating a conducive national environment for investment and the ease of doing business. Last year, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu signed 4 executive orders to curb double taxation. The government also established the Presidential Task Force on review of fiscal policy and tax reform.
More so, it will be recalled that Nigeria is also calling on the United Nations Security Council to give just representation to Africa on a permanent basis at the UN Security Council, emphasizing its importance for conscientious global peace, inclusivity, security, deepening global peace, and building trust. Joining us now on this morning show is Professor Osita Agbu, Professor of International Relations and the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Academics at Base University, Abuja. Professor Agbu, good morning, and thank you for joining us on the morning show.
Good morning, Dr. Ruben Abati. My pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you indeed. Well, quickly, for you to start by reviewing Nigeria's national statement at the 79th UNGA in New York, presented on behalf of the Nigerian president by the vice president who represented him at that forum. We've already outlined the issues, and they are issues you are very well familiar with.
Thank you very much. Yes, the UNGA is usually a place where countries put forward their various concerns, both global concerns as well as national concerns. And through our Vice President, Nigeria has put forward areas she thinks that she wants to be heard by the global community, which you just mentioned some of them. The concern about the increasing incidence of singularity and nationalism, as opposed to the age-long position that countries like Nigeria had taken, and that is multilateralism, as a solution to many of the problems plaguing the world today. Nigeria has concerns about debt, the increasing debts of the developing world, and what can be done to have it reduced, as has been done in the past through debt forgiveness and et cetera, et cetera. Other issues, and of course the more important one that appears to be more topical amongst the many issues that the Mr. President brought forward at UNGA, the 79th UNGA, is the issue of fair representation of Africa in the United Nations Security Council. This has been on the front burner for several decades. Sometimes before the United Nations General Assembly, the trend seems to be that, yes, this is the time to do it. However, I don't know whether this is the right time, really, to push this particular agenda against the background of the kinds of global concerns we have now, and the wars that are going on around the world, and some of the weaknesses, what I consider weaknesses, of Africa in particular, against the backdrop of Africa trying to have a fair representation in the United Nations Security Council. So these are my thoughts. Well, if you allow me to go forward, of course, Nigeria is one of the key candidates, one of the key candidates for the United Nations Security Council, in addition to 2 or 3 other countries. Over the years, Nigeria has always raised this issue. It is not surprising that she's still bringing the issue on the front burner of the global community. However, again, like I said, against the backdrop of our experiences in the recent past, I don't know whether that should be uppermost in our priorities at this point in time.
Interesting you say that, because earlier I'd opined that one of the main takeaways for us as a nation at UNGA 79 would be to have that seat at the table. What would you say then would be some of your concerns, or why you feel that this is not the time to pursue that? I mean, it's time for Africa to have a seat at the table. I know you might have, so I'd like to hear why you wouldn't think this is a good time for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Why I say that is because we say that country's foreign policy is a continuation of its domestic environment. We all know the problems that take Nigeria, for example, that Nigeria is going through right now. If you check all the indices that will make a country to be strong, capable, and able to play a very important role in the United Nations Security Council, you find out that at this point in time, Nigeria appears to be weak on all fronts, to the extent that if you put Nigeria side by side with other countries in Africa who are canvassing for a place in the United Nations Security Council, it will be very difficult. I think we should not deceive ourselves. It will be very difficult for Nigeria to get the kind of backing she needs, even from our African brothers and sisters. That is why I say what I said. We've been a very faithful member of the United Nations. Professor
Agbu, is that an indication of more work to be done on the African continent in terms of unity and being able to speak with one voice? Because that's a genuine concern, but then it speaks to greater challenges around even Africa speaking united and speaking with one voice.
Exactly, because at the United Nations, what you're saying is actually true. At the United Nations, there is politics. That is politics at United Nations, and some of these positions come through the various regions, the regional groupings. And so we have the Africa group. And so it is absolutely necessary for you to have the backing of your own group, whether you're coming from Asia, Oceania, Africa, Southern America, or Northern America. You must have the backing of other countries in that region for your candidacy to have the support it needs, and then you garner more support from other parts of the world, and then you can be able to push forward your case. As it is now, we are in ECOWAS, and we know how ECOWAS is right now. We know how the economies in many African countries are. We know how our domestic politics is. Many of these indices do not indicate that we are quite ready to push at this point in time. I'm not saying that in the near future, it cannot still be on the front burner and we cannot still aspire to be in the United Nations Security Council, but I do not think that that is a priority. For us, yes, for other African countries, yes, it is possible that they can say, yes, we are ready for this job because it's a job you're going to do there. You're not going there for a funfair. You must have the capacity and the capability to be able to have effective representation of the peoples of Africa at the global stage.
Okay. Let's go back and talk about this divide between the West and Africa and the real solutions to the problem, which is a great deal of economic liberalism. If you took our time to listen to the president of Argentina's speech, it says it's no longer the time for socialism, which is some form of tokenism from the West to us. We're always going cap in hand to beg. That we must emancipate all these countries on the lower rung of the ladder. That means the rights, the things that have been taken through colonialism away from these countries, and their capacity to be able to build industries. What's your take about that conversation?
Thank you, Rufai. Now you're taking the conversation much deeper for us to understand. Yes, this tokenism and always relying on the West to help you to do things. I'm not saying there's anything wrong in asking for assistance, asking for economic assistance, asking for foreign direct investment. But at the same time, you have to be ready to receive those investments. Do you have the human resource? Do you have the infrastructure to be able to receive? Do you have the domestic environment? Do you have a benign political domestic environment to be able to receive those resources? What I'm trying to say in effect is that what the Argentinian president was saying is that we need to do things for ourselves. We need to manage things better for ourselves. If we cannot manage ourselves, cannot manage our resources, cannot manage our relations, how then do you expect that you can be able to manage things that will come from outside? And this has been the problem with many African countries. Yes, we suffered colonialism, neo-colonialism, etc., but at this point in time, we should stop begging, always begging. We should try and manage ourselves and manage our resources. When you have attained some semblance of seriousness and stability, then you can ask the world to help you. This is my view on things like this. Okay, everywhere in the world you have conflicts. I'm digressing a little bit to conflict, but it's still related to developmental issues. Everywhere there are conflicts. We were left with conflict in Africa. Our borders were arbitrarily balkanized by the colonizing forces, and they left us with a big problem all over Africa. Now, the problem is for us to be able to manage it. Conflicts will always be there. The important thing is, how do you manage the conflicts? While other peoples around the world have been able to manage their conflicts reasonably well, we have, in most cases, been unable to manage our own conflicts, resulting into some of the political crises we have, as well as our economic woes that we have today. So until we are serious enough and we're able to manage, conflicts will always be there. Sometimes even conflict makes for progress. But if you're able to manage our conflicts reasonably well, then we can be able to get on the tangent for development, and then we can be able to ask for assistance, even becoming a member of the United Nations Security Council. I do not think that is our utmost priority today. Yes, we can ask the world to assist us with improving our control over environment, the insecurities we have in the Sahel and in West Africa, technological surveillance, etc., training for our people, etc. They can help us with that. You need to have control of your environment, have control of some reasonable control over your economy, and always make sure that your people are okay, reasonably okay, before you begin to go for bigger things at the global stage.
Professor
or
Agbu.
Else you will not be able to have provide good representation for the peoples of Africa.
Okay.
Sorry I speak this way, but that is the way I say it.
Okay, Professor Agbu, let me ask...
Go on, Dr. Bati, I'm with you.
Let me ask an umbrella question. There are persons who have hold the view that the UN, as it is now, post-World War II, in the view of, the emergence of new axes of power and influence, that the UN as it is today is dysfunctional in terms of managing global peace, particularly against the background of the conflicts that we have seen. Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Hamas, Israel, Gaza, Sudan, Syria, all kinds of conflicts. And people are saying, look, this United Nations, there must be a rethinking. Do you agree that it's a dysfunctional, toothless institution to maintain global peace as it is now?
Thank you, Dr. Bati. This is a very recent concern of many people, including very young people. I watched a clip some months ago of a young girl of about 18 to 21 years. I think she's a Palestinian. And she was making a comment in one of the media outlets, and she was saying, as far as she's concerned, the United Nations is of little of no use to anybody, because it appears that the United Nations is toothless or sometimes even biased. That made me to think a lot that really this young girl in her generation seems to have a point. But at the same time, when I thought deeply about it, I said, yes, it appears that the United Nations is becoming increasingly powerless in the face of the complexity of problems and conflicts that you have in the world today. But on the other hand, we also need to remember that the United Nations has also played a very important role in curtailing conflicts around the world, in the various peacekeeping missions, in the various organs of the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the ICC, the United Nations Social and Economic Agency, World Health Organization, addressing COVID, addressing this, addressing that. So the United Nations is not irrelevant. So in the area of conflicts, curtailing of conflicts, yes, there seems to be some dysfunctionality in the operations of the United Nations because, as we rightly said earlier, because of some of the positions that the important countries in the world have taken, especially some members of the P5, that is the countries that have the veto power. These countries are backing, like what we mentioned, what Nigeria mentioned at UNGA, at the 79th UNGA, on singularity and nationalism, and forgetting multilateralism, which has been a basis in which we have tried to protect the world from conflicts in many years. So to some extent, when it comes to the area of conflict management and the bias, you find out that some countries have tended to misuse the good offices of the United Nations. I must give kudos to the United Nations Secretary General. It has not been easy for him trying to navigate the dictates of the great powers of the world and at the same time trying to protect the peoples of the world. I know how sensitive that position is. And so that's why he has been very careful, always calling for de-escalation, etc., etc. While some countries play the spoilers. On one hand, they tell us we want to de-escalate, we want to have peace in the world. At the same time, they are arming the forces that are out there, killing innocent people, women and children. This is the situation in the world today. So it is not also very easy for United Nations. United Nations is not irrelevant, has a role to play, is still playing the role, only that when it comes to issues of conflict and wars, it has become increasingly difficult because of the singularity and some nationalist sentiments that we see today in the world. So it behaves on other member nations of United Nations to know what to do, to be able to checkmate the excesses of some of the powers of the world who tend to support, they say one thing with one side of their mouth and do the other do another thing on the other side. So that is the situation. But my last thought on this particular tangent is that it is always important for us to remember, for countries to remember, for the members of the United Nations Security Council, as well as the warring parties, whether in Gaza, in southern Lebanon, or in Ukraine, or in Russia, as the case may be, that at the end of the day, you should put the people first.
Okay, so let me now come from there.
You should put the people first.
In terms of putting the people first, it's interesting that UNGA is going on whilst there was, what rumors of wars raging in the Middle East and still the battle with Russia and Ukraine. But let me come to the Middle East because it's now dominated headlines and the fear of even further tensions and this war escalating. Do you think the United Nations has played a significant role in either, one, escalating tensions or diffusing tensions, especially with regards to their stance or their support of Israel in this war? Do you think they could have done better to try to de-escalate tensions, or have they used everything within their powers or influence?
Sorry, are you talking of United Nations or United States?
No, United Nations now, in terms of war and peace, and I know that's a conversation. The Security Council, war and peace, the stance. Usually, when it comes to the Security Council, they've abstained very largely when it comes to interventions in this sort of conflicts. But it's going back to that question where you talk about in maintaining peace across the world and the strength of the United Nations, and what, if there's any significant role they've played in this conflict in the Middle East. That's what I was asking.
Thank you very much. Yes, the United Nations has tried severally to intervene in the conflict in the Middle East. It is a very complex, very complex conflict that began sometime in the 1880s, even from the Ottoman Empire, the displacement of the Palestinians and the arrival of the Jews from all over the world, including also from some Arab countries. All through these decades, the United Nations has at one point in time intervened to various conferences, agreements, etc., to try to find a solution to the Middle East crisis. And at the end of the day, I think at a point in time, they arrived at the two-state solution. The two-state solution of let the Arabs have this portion and let Israel have this portion. Unfortunately, at that point in time, Israel actually accepted the two-state solution, but the Arab countries declined to accept. And since then, the problem has continued and has now engulfed Gaza after the various wars we have had in 1948, in 1967, in 1973, up to the present 2023. So it has escalated to include the other portions, Gaza, the West Bank, and now southern Lebanon. The UN has served as a moderating voice. While some other countries in the world, especially the Western powers, they have kind of, at different points in time, depending on their strategic interests, have actually added fuel to the crisis in the Middle East. They claim to be seeking for solutions in the Middle East, but at the end of the day, they end up escalating the problem in the Middle East because they have strategic interests. My thinking is this: for many of the Western countries, in order to curtail terrorism, global terrorism or international terrorism, they feel that it is necessary for them to intervene, at the right time in the Middle East, depending on the conflict, to reduce the possibilities of terrorists being bred in the Middle East and being unleashed around the world. So when some countries support Israel, when some Western countries support Israel, it's because Israel is also an instrument of their diplomacy. Okay. Not probably because they love Israel, but Israel is on the ground, and so they see the opportunity, they use Israel to degrade the potentialities of future terrorism, future international terrorism in the world. Okay. And so that is how some of these countries play it out in the Middle East. So the Middle East is a very complex conflict, but as I said, some very serious problems can be resolved by simply putting the people at the center of the problem. For the peoples of southern Lebanon, the Lebanese, for the Gazans, for the people in the West Bank, for the Arab, and for the Jews. Okay, Prof. If you put the people at the center, then many of these issues will reduce. Thank you very much.
Prof, real quickly.
Yes, please.
I want to ask about the role of the deep states in America and the interplay of the United Nations in this conflict going on in the Middle East. The role of the deep states in America and the interplay of the United Nations, because the United Nations has not been able to clamp down on these actors.
Yes. You are quite right. This is also, like I said earlier, in foreign policy and foreign diplomacy, you also have a domestic component. And so, yes, you do have a deep state. Yes, you do have some very deep lobbies in the United States with very strategic interests that are able to influence the governments, not just in the United States, but in other parts of the world. They are able to bring to bear their lobbying, and they are able to influence the policies of countries, and sometimes you find these policies manifesting at the level of the United Nations. And so you cannot rule that out. And so, yes, there's a case to be made, therefore, for the expansion of the United Nations Security Council away from the P5 that arose after the Second World War, because the configurations and the nature of the conflicts in the world today has changed. Today we talk of missiles, we talk of cruise missiles, and we talk of all kinds of new technological war machines that were not existing in 1945. And therefore it's necessary for some of the newly emergent countries, and we know the newly emergent countries around the world, to also be allowed the opportunity to be members of the United Nations Security Council so that they can be able to checkmate the excesses of the sitting members of the P5.
Okay.
And so that is a way to checkmate and make sure that you reduce some of the influence of the lobbies you have around the world.
The demand is for democracy, inclusivity, a sense of belonging, greater participation on the Security Council. On that note, we would like to thank you very much, Professor Osita Agbu, for joining us on the morning show.